Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Appropriately, we're discussing the Sochi Olympics in Russia on what some are viewing as a Siberian day in our city. Some just don't know what cold weather is. We do welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would remind everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage website immediately following for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Our initial three presenters will have individual remarks. They will then be joined back up on stage together for a brief Q&A. Then it will be followed by our panel discussion. Hosting our panel discussion will be Dr. Stephen Bucci, who is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. And opening our program this morning is my colleague, Dr. Ariel Cohen, Senior Research Fellow in the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies. Please join me in welcoming Ariel Cohen. Ariel?
Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. My name is Ariel Cohen. We are at an inflection point for Russia, I believe. This is the time when Russia is coming to grips because of the Sochi Olympics with systemic issues that have been plaguing it since it became independent of the Soviet Union over 20 years ago. I will cover these issues in my presentation later on today, but suffice to say that allegations of corruption, ethnic and religious conflict, terrorism, insufficient infrastructure, and issues of human rights violations and authoritarian rule are all in the spotlight today. I cannot think of a better analyst to address these issues than Stanislav Belovsky, my colleague and someone I've known for over 15 years, one of the most quoted analysts on Russia, the most quoted analyst on Russia in Russia. Stanislav started out as a systems analyst and worked on cyber economics. Then he became a political analyst and worked with Boris Berezovsky, the late Boris Berezovsky, including the launch of the Unity Party that later became the ruling party of Russia, United Russia. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have one of the birth parents of United Russia here today. Stanislav also worked with Ukrainian political actors back in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, and in 2002 founded the Council for National Strategy that is still active today, and where a number of current younger Russian political analysts and spin doctors work. But of course, Stanislav is probably the number one spin doctor today in Russia.
After you, of course.
I'm not in Russia. He is the author of the following political concepts: transformation of Russia into a parliamentary republic, including potentially a constitutional monarchy, transformation of Russian Orthodox Church into a confederation of independent parishes. He is the author of 12 books, including The Business of Vladimir Putin, where, to the best of my knowledge, the first time public discussion of the wealth of Mr. Putin was presented, and the latest, Vladimir, All Truth About Putin, 2013, published in Germany. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stanislav Bilkovsky. Oh, and by the way, his foundation's report and the summary of his presentation are available outside on the table.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased. Russia is still so attractive for American elites, so I could see so many influential and interesting people in that audience. And I only hope our discussion would be not less interesting than the State of the Union address of President Obama expected today. So nobody in this audience would be disappointed nor disillusioned on our discussion. So as far as I understand my mission, I should deliver some information and my view on Sochi Olympics, human rights in Russia, and Russia-United States relations. When I heard first from Mr. Cohen about the topic of this conference, I asked to give me about 12 hours to talk elaborately on that. But now I have just 30 minutes, so I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Such Olympic Games, from the sports point of view, in my opinion, is nothing so much interesting. It's just an Olympic Games happening every 4 years in any country of the world. But it could be interesting just reflecting the basic philosophy of modern Russia, of its powers, of how the Russian economy is built and what the basics, the foundations of the system are, and of course Vladimir Putin as a symbol of the modern Russia, regardless of how we estimate him, how we evaluate him. And I spent a considerable part of my life to persuade the whole world I could address to explain Vladimir Putin is not so much important for the modern Russia. He is just an elite moderator and the reflection of what the philosophy of Russian elite is, but not the leader who determines the real destiny of Russia and the place and role of the modern Russia in the world. But misfortunately, I failed. And I'm quite sure everybody in this audience wants to hear something about Vladimir Putin, his intentions, his priorities, and what Vladimir Putin thinks and does, what he is going to do. Nobody knows it for sure, because Vladimir Putin is a very isolated person, and I think there are just a few people really knowing what he does think and what he is going to do in any directions of his activities, but nonetheless, everybody knows about Vladimir Putin. Everybody knows what Vladimir Putin is, or at least everybody strives to know it. And I'm not an exception. So I'll tell about Sochi Olympics. Sochi Olympics has been widely and hardly criticized for its concepts. First and foremost, for the place chosen for the Olympic Games, because this subtropical resort is hardly suitable for the winter sports as far as they are perceived worldwide. And we could quite realize that in 2007, when the International Olympic Committee decided to grant Russia and Sochi with the Winter Olympics, Sochi was not at all prepared for that mission. And certainly it was quite uncompetitive to Austrian Salzburg and Korean Pyeongchang, which were 99% prepared for holding Olympic Games any time, any day since. But for Vladimir Putin, it was a very important decision and very important project, not because of politics itself, not because of any priorities of national strategy as it widely considered, widely and in my opinion, not very correctly considered. It was because any leader, in my opinion, regardless of his personality scale, at some moment in its life, starts to think what his place in history really is, and what chapter in the history textbook of its country he would really control and would be the basic hero of. And Vladimir Putin is not an exception. I believe the basic mistake in Vladimir Putin's perception worldwide, and the perception of any observers, analysts who try to understand this political personality for many years of its presence and power, is to perceive Vladimir Putin as a strategist who has any long-term plan of the country development or any long-term goals and objectives of his presence and power. Vladimir Putin is a tactician. We should not ask Vladimir Putin what would happen in 2018 when his current presidential term is over, because Vladimir Putin doesn't know what would happen in March and even in February during the Olympic Games. Anybody who tells that Vladimir Putin was quite sure that in 2008 he would get back in 2012 instead of Dmitry Medvedev is a little bit mistaken, because Vladimir Putin did not know it, and just a few months ahead of the dramatic decision of September 24th, 2011, when it had been proclaimed Vladimir Putin gets back to presidential post and Dmitry Medvedev just becomes a technical prime minister under him. President Putin promised in Stockholm during his official visit to Sweden that the decision about the new Russian president in 2012 would be quite favorable, suitable, and likable by Europe. He could not, by no means, he couldn't mean himself. He meant Medvedev, but in my opinion, the Arab Spring and the fears of Vladimir Putin and some elite members very close to him personally and highly connected and interconnected with him as far as business matters are concerned, brought him to the conclusion that if some kind of Arab Spring would be injected to Russia, and because Vladimir Putin, of course, is quite sure that the Occidental world has been behind the Arab Spring, and not the internal processes stemming from the very profound, from the profundis, from the very profundity of problems being accumulated for ages in Arab countries led to Arab Spring and the chain of revolutions in countries of Middle East and North Africa. But he's quite sure, because he's a paranoid by his psychotype. And Putin has never been in doubt that America, France, as far as the Libya is concerned, Great Britain inspired the chain of revolutions in the world. So he was very afraid that if something happens, something of this type, of this kind happens in the modern Russia, Dmitry Medvedev could prove too weak to resist it. That's why he decided to get back to presidential post just a few months before the decision was publicly declared in September of 2011. So Sochi Olympic Games are just a reflection of the same approach, the basic psychological rather than political or economical approach of Mr. Putin. The president of Russia, and we should perceive him simpler than we are accustomed to, than he used to be perceived for his many years in power. We should understand that Vladimir Putin has never been dreaming of becoming Russian president. And in August of 1999, when Boris Yeltsin appointed him as prime minister and Yeltsin's successor, Putin was rather disappointed and frightened than happy about such a decision. And only his willingness and his psychological leaning toward the figure of father, whom Boris Yeltsin has been for him for many years, just as Anatoly Sobchak, the former mayor of St. Petersburg, has been for him in early 1990s, because Sobchak and Yeltsin created Putin's career in politics, not post-Soviet special services, as it's widely perceived in the world. This willingness and this devotedness to this feeling of being Yeltsin's son made him so determined and made him to become Yeltsin's successor without any objections. Though Roman Abramovich and Boris Berezovsky, two big businessmen of Yeltsin's Russia, who shaped to a very considerable extent the sense and essence of business in the modern Russia, told me that Vladimir Putin did not want to be president. He wanted to be something like chief of Gazprom or such kind of corporation. He considered himself as a big state-owned corporation chief executive officer and nothing more, not taking responsibility for this huge and hardly manageable country. We should understand at the same time that Vladimir Putin spent the considerable part of his years in Germany. In East Germany, but it's not so important within the context of what we are discussing now. Since mid-1980s, and I believe Vladimir Putin spent in Germany about 7 years, 1983 through 1990. Vladimir Putin has seen the German as an ideotype of worker, as an ideotype of citizen. Being child of St. Petersburg outskirts himself, Putin learned in Germany that if you want to create something large scale, if you want to transform the country, if you want to create a manageable system, you should be German rather than Russian. Because Russian people are not suitable for such kind of a task. Russian people are very creative. Russians are good dreamers. Russians could come to brilliant ideas, but they could never be managers nor workers. And it's a fruit of the very dramatic Russian history and of the conditions of very hot climate and hardly manageable territory. And any large-scale results and building up the Russian statehood, Russian economy, and transforming this country into the superpower, which it has been since 1945 through late 1980s, has been achieved through totalitarian mechanisms and methods, through Gulag, first and foremost, created by Joseph Stalin, who understood very much that understood very well that just such way could make Russian people to work within some short period strategy and to provide Russia becoming really independent on any external factors and sources. Vladimir and Sochi Olympic Games, why have I dedicated so much time to explaining the historical and psychological aspects of Putin's perception of his own country? Sochi Olympic Games is something that would, in Putin's opinion, would be kept in the textbooks of Russian history. And if Vladimir Putin is told that much money has been stolen during the preparation of Olympic Games infrastructure in Sochi, Putin would easily reply, yes, it costed $60 billion, but if I did not decide to organize the Olympic Games in Sochi. $60 billion could be stolen anyway, but we haven't got any Olympic Games, any infrastructure, and this the only resort in Russia favorable as far as both climate and any additional conditions are concerned, could never be brought to international standards. That's what Vladimir Putin would say. So for him, any corruption allegations are not important, are not crucial. He achieved what he wanted to achieve, and I think the basic idea for him is to survive the Olympic Games without any terrorist attacks and without seeing what could happen to all those stadiums and other Olympic objects suffering from this really abnormal paces and of the absurdity of the conditions under which they were built up. So Olympic Games have been widely criticized for also as a sign of Vladimir Putin's international recognition. Though he's an authoritarian leader and we know what the real situation with the human rights in the modern Russia is. Vladimir Putin, going on with Vladimir Putin psychological analysis, we should say that Vladimir Putin is a classical monetocrat, I would call it. He believes in the superpower of money. For him, money is everything, and through money, and by establishment of viable mechanisms of money injection, we could resolve any problem we have. And the position of International Olympic Committee and international sports bureaucracy towards Sochi Olympic Games. And we know that for many years, though everybody having eyes saw how far the Sochi is from being prepared for the Olympic Games, international Olympic committees and international sport bureaucrats confirmed that everything is brilliant, and Sochi is quite prepared for the Olympic Games. And through bribing the international sports bureaucracy, Vladimir Putin has proved himself that money could resolve anything, and he could bribe anybody in this world. Of course, his friendship with Gerhard Schröder, Silvio Berlusconi, and some other leaders proved it as well, but Sochi Olympic Games is important with this point of view also. Well, Mr. Cohen has told me I have just 5 minutes because I have criticized Vladimir Putin a little bit more than Heritage Foundation could afford. Yeah, it's becoming not so interesting as Barack Obama's State of the Union address. So I just wanted, finalizing my speech, I just wanted to attract your attention to my report, Russian Wars 2013, which I asked to distribute among the participants in the conference, and I am very grateful to Heritage Foundation. It agreed. And because if you read this report tonight, if you don't want, because I think Heritage Foundation is a Republican leading institution, and maybe you are so annoyed and irritated by the necessity to hear State of the Union address of Mr. Obama, the contents of which you do already know. So maybe instead of Obama's speech, you pay some attention to my report, and you find out everything you want to find out. You will know everything you want to know about the elite conflicts in the modern Russia. Maybe it would improve your understanding what's going on in the modern Russia and what elite conflicts determine and shape the political situation in my country, and what the sources of what the Russian political opposition really is. And so maybe tomorrow, after you read it instead of State of the Union address of Barack Obama, we get back to this discussion, and maybe I'll have 10 minutes more to ask, what have you found out from my report? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker, the Honorable Senator Ted Cruz, was elected as the 34th senator from Texas. He is a passionate fighter for limited government, economic growth, and the U.S. Constitution. Ted won a decisive victory in both the Republican primary and general election, despite having never before being elected to office. In the Senate, Ted serves on Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation, the Committee on Armed Services, the Committees on Judiciary, Special Committee on Aging, Committee on Rules and Administration. Before being elected, Ted received national acclaim as Solicitor General of Texas, the state's chief lawyer before the U.S. Supreme Court. Serving under Attorney General Greg Abbott, Ted was the nation's youngest Solicitor General, the longest service Solicitor General in Texas, and the first Hispanic Solicitor General in Texas. In his private practice, he led one of the largest U.S. firms' Supreme Court and national appellate legislation practice. He has authored more of the 80 U.S. Supreme Court briefs and argued 43 oral arguments, including 9 before the Supreme Court. Ted graduated with honors from Princeton University with honors from Harvard Law School. He served as a law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist on the U.S. Supreme Court and was first Hispanic ever to clerk for Chief Justice of the United States. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a hand to Senator Ted Cruz.
Good morning, and thank you. It is a pleasure to be back at Heritage, to be with so many friends, and to have the opportunity to discuss an issue of such pressing importance, which is namely the growing influence Russia is having in the world, the lack of focus on human rights, the lack of U.S. leadership championing freedom, and the lack of effective leadership defending our interest in the world, which is making the world a much more dangerous place. Today, Russia is going the wrong way on human rights, and U.S. foreign policy right now is so rudderless that we either can't or won't take a stand on this issue. We need to get back to our long tradition of standing up for the human rights of every human being on earth. Because the United States is receding from global leadership, the consequence is that Russia is stepping in from Egypt to Syria to Iran. We are seeing spheres of influence grow that diminishes our role and ultimately diminishes the hope that every person might have to live in freedom. Now, emphasizing human rights is not just disinterested do-gooding. It is speaking for the fundamental values of who we are as Americans. And it emphasizes our history and our tradition and the impact that that has had promoting peace in the world. You know, the best model, I think, for how to deal with Russia is a model we saw of President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan never shied from speaking the truth. And by the way, this is not the simplistic version that some in the foreign policy world would have you believe, that if the United States stands up and speaks on human rights, it means we can't deal with another nation. President Reagan established a personal relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev, sat down over and over again bargaining to protect U.S. national security, ultimately setting the foundation to end the Cold War, and he did it throughout while speaking up for human rights. For example, Ronald Reagan, when he signed Human Rights Day proclamation on December 10th, 1986. Here's what President Reagan said at that time. We're honored this morning to have with us Mr. Yuri Orlov and Mr. Natan Sharansky, who, along with other brave individuals, people of extraordinary moral courage, have suffered Many are even now in labor camps or Siberian exile for the ideals that we proclaim today. The United States intends to hold the Soviet Union to the human rights commitments it made at Helsinki. The Soviet government, despite a few gestures this year, gestures that reflect posturing rather than flexibility, continues its systematic violation of human rights, the restriction of immigration, the suppression of dissent, the lengthy separation of families and spouses, the continued imprisonment of religious activists in Ukraine and throughout the Soviet Union are the orders of the day. These realities remain unacceptable, and we will continue to do our utmost to press for change and to bring our moral and diplomatic weight to bear on behalf of those brave souls who speak out within the Soviet bloc. Can you imagine the current President of the United States speaking like that? What a sad statement that it's almost impossible to imagine that clarity of force, that voice for freedom and for human rights coming from the current administration. We need to get back to the voice that America has been. You know, Sharansky describes how the prisoners in the gulags would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Did you hear what he said? He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He said Marxism-Leninism would end up on the ash heap of history. He went to the Brandenburg Gate. He stood in front of the world and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. American leadership and unambiguous advocacy of human rights and freedom penetrates the darkness of oppression. And we need to get back to it. We seem to have forgotten that tradition, and human rights abuses plummeted initially with the fall of the Soviet Union. But the price for such rapid liberalization was the constant threat of political chaos. Under Vladimir Putin, political stability has been achieved at the cost of human rights. Particularly after his re-election, Putin has been increasingly autocratic in terms of human rights. Almost exactly 1 year ago, Human Rights Watch named 2012 as the worst year on record for human rights in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. The record is chilling, even if it's more targeted and surgical than the abuses under the Soviets. From everyone from political opponents like Alexei Navalny to punk rock bands. And as much as my staff wants me to share the name of the particular punk rock band, I'm going to declaim from articulating their name and leave it to other sources. But it says something that the government of Russia views the persecution of punk rock bands as within its purview and perfectly appropriate. Now, Putin's apparent moderation coming up to the Sochi Olympics with the, quote, early release of some of those imprisoned, including the punk rock band in question. Were both done by decree rather than actually reform of the legal system. And if you can release someone by arbitrary decree, you can pick them up by arbitrary decree the next day. Because the United States is globally receding from leadership, we're seeing Putin and Russia expand its role in the world. We're seeing it in Egypt. We're seeing it in Iran. We're seeing it in Syria. You want to talk about foreign policy from the United States that has lost its moorings. This administration's announced unilateral military strike against Syria that ultimately went off the rails because it didn't have a clear, articulable U.S. national security interest. The result of that was such a debacle that there was serious discussion in some quarters about Putin being a credible candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me say this. If U.S. foreign policy is so bungled that it makes Putin seem like the good guy and an advocate for peace, we have done something very, very wrong. You know, the world has seen some great chess matches. And yet in the geopolitical stage, it is almost as if the Russians have a renowned grandmaster playing chess, and the United States is playing checkers. We're not even playing the same game. And the consequences are grave, not just for the United States, but for the world. For example, the Obama administration needs to be called to account for its refusal to properly enforce the Magnitsky Act of 2012. You know, this piece of legislation was named for the brave whistleblower, Sergei Magnitsky, who died in police custody in 2009. And it's worth revisiting his story because it underscores what it means to speak out for freedom and the role the United States should play. From 2007 to 2008, the Russian government framed the giant private equity fund, Hermitage Capital Management, for tax fraud. Sergei Magnitsky, an attorney whose firm represented Hermitage, eventually discovered $230 million in tax fraud and a paper trail revealing that Russian officials used stolen documents from the hedge fund to concoct false accusations based on forged and backdated contracts. In November 2008, Russian authorities targeted Sergei, charged him with tax fraud. He was imprisoned in Moscow's Interior Ministry's detention center, where he was tortured and pressured to sign false confessions admitting to these crimes. Over the next 2 months, Sergei underwent unspeakable conditions, living with 8 inmates in a room with 4 beds. He lost 40 pounds, and he developed pancreatitis and gallstones. On November 16, 2009, his conditions worsened sharply. Doctors placed him in a straitjacket, left him alone in a room, and waited until he was dead. In December of 2012, the United States passed the Magnitsky Act, committing to a blacklist of Russian officials who have committed fraud or other abuses, as well as those that contributed directly to the death of Sergei Magnitsky. It states that the U.S. shall support and provide assistance to the efforts of Russian people to establish a true democratic political system that respects individual liberties and human rights. The Magnitsky Act was called by David Kramer, the president of Freedom House, the most significant human rights legislation about Russia since the end of the Cold War. But inexplicably, the Obama administration has failed and indeed openly refused to comply with this act by listing the relevant human rights abusers. Last April, they sanctioned 19 individuals directly implicated in the death of Mr. Magnitsky, and they promised an additional list of names of those guilty by the December 20th deadline. Apparently, the list of 20 names was prepared, and yet December 20th came and went. And because Russia was ostensibly being helpful in brokering an historically terrible deal with Iran, the administration decided those names need not be made public. What a terrible statement to the world. It's not only an abuse of laws here, it is a precedent that tells Russia, look, the president here doesn't have to follow the laws. There are laws on the books passed by Congress, signed into law in the United States Code, and the President of the United States can simply say, I will not comply. Why on earth should the President of Russia comply with any laws there? What standing do we have to criticize the President of Russia if our President is simultaneously saying he likes the idea of not complying with laws either? we should follow the law. And the idea that we would trade fidelity to law and trade standing up against human rights abuses to what's perceived as temporary help in a negotiation, I might add, that shares all of the virtues of the lost role of American leadership in foreign policy. The Iranian nuclear deal, I will confess, I very much agree with Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It is a very, very bad deal and an historic mistake. And what's chilling is we seem to be repeating the same mistakes we made in the 1990s with North Korea, where the United States brought together foreign nations, said, let's relax the sanctions on North Korea because we trust them. And what happened? They used the relaxed sanctions, the billions of dollars we allowed to flow into North Korea, to develop nuclear weapons. This deal is doing the very same thing in Iran, and I'll tell you the difference is North Korea, when they acquired nuclear weapons, they haven't used those weapons. It's an extraordinary danger that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but at the end of the day, North Korea's leadership seems to want nothing more than to stay in power, which means there is some version of rational deterrence that is possible if someone is focused on their own self-preservation, as Kim Jong-un appears to be. The danger of Iran is if you listen to what the Ayatollah is saying, to what the mullahs are saying, rational self-preservation is not their objective. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the odds are unacceptably high that that weapon will not be simply stockpiled, but it'll be detonated over Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. Those risks are unacceptable. That's what receding U.S. leadership means. And the idea that we would back away from U.S. law holding Russia's human rights abuses to account simply because there is a desperate desire to cut a deal. It seems any deal, just cut a deal. It says something when President Rouhani is boasting to the world, the United States has succumbed to our will. What a dramatic lack of leadership when it comes to protecting U.S. national security. And we need look no further than Ukraine to see a moment right now that desperately cries out for U.S. leadership. It is not complicated what Putin seeks to do. Putin is working to systematically reassemble the old Soviet Union, to expand his power. He has been candid about his desire for greater power and control and global reach. Now, the United States right now is facilitating that by stepping back and allowing him that leadership. But what is happening in Ukraine is critical both from the perspective of justice but also from the perspective of U.S. national security interests. We were caught napping in Ukraine. It seemed the administration just assumed that they would sign the trade agreement with the European Union and pursue a bid to join NATO. And we failed to anticipate that Putin, trying to rebuild the old Soviet Union, would swoop in. President Yanukovych has taken more from Putin than money. He has taken the direct strategy and approach of moving to suppress the Ukrainian people's rights brutally with a jackboot and a rifle. His political opponents are languishing in prison. And yet the people of Ukraine are crying out to be free. You cannot help but watch the scenes of hundreds of thousands of people braving bitter cold. All of us bundled up in our jackets because it's a little bit nippy outside in Washington. Go to the streets of Kiev with the brutal winter barreling down. And yet, you see the proud Ukrainian people standing up to be free. They don't want to be dominated by Putin's Russia. They want to stand free, and they want to stand with the West. It makes a difference for Russia, obviously for Ukraine, for Europe, for America, and for the world if Ukraine is allowed to be free, allowed to join the West, allowed to be an ally and stand with the United States, or if they are crushed by Russia's dominance. We have a stake in that outcome. And yet this administration has been far too silent. You know, there's a striking op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal. By the former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, where he describes one Ukrainian protester beaten, stripped down naked, and made to stand in the freezing cold. And yet what is incredible is what he describes is that Ukrainian protester standing unbowed, freezing, beaten, bleeding, and yet unbound. Those are the stories of human perseverance in the face of evil that won the Cold War. And the United States needs to be making absolutely clear that we stand with those who are protesting for freedom. We should consider both short-term and long-term steps right now to impact what's happening in Ukraine, including, number one, a free trade zone, possibly including other states such as Georgia, Latvia, Moldova, and Estonia, which could have an enormous economic impact, particularly in conjunction with the free trade deal the European Union has been discussing. The United States could and should extend immediate free trade to the people of Ukraine right now, to demonstrate the West wants you to stand with us and not be subject to dominance by Russia. And in particular, one of the great weapons of blackmail that Russia uses over Ukraine is natural gas. The United States should act vigorously to counteract that, to insulate them from that blackmail. And in particular, we should share the expertise of American companies right now to assist in the development of Ukraine's domestic shale gas reserves. We should assist with the construction of liquid natural gas import infrastructure so that Ukraine is not dependent on Russia with the ability to cut off the gas and cut off their lifeline. And we should move forward immediately to allowing LNG exports from the United States to Ukraine as the infrastructure is put in place so that Ukraine is no longer dependent on Russia, but that we can help provide the resources in the free market to the Ukrainian people so that they can stand on their own and limit the growing reach and expanse of Putin. What I want to say in conclusion is we have nothing to gain by ceding our principles, by abandoning what we believe, and giving in to Putin and Russia. Several months ago, I had the opportunity to interview two Cuban dissidents, Guillermo Fariñas and Elizardo Sanchez, who are brave dissidents who have spoken up against the brutal oppression that is communist Cuba. Now that's something I personally know a great deal about, being the son of a teenage immigrant who fled Cuba. My father was tortured and imprisoned by Batista. My aunt, his younger sister, was tortured and imprisoned by Castro. What was striking listening to Mr. Fariñas and Mr. Sanchez was they described how the Castros were trying to follow what they called the Putin playbook. In fact, they described it in Spanish as Putinismo. That's what Raul Castro is doing, is implementing Putinismo. And what they describe from the perspective of people seeing the brutal oppression of communism is to pretend to liberalize, to get concessions from the United States while at the same time keeping a firm grip on the police state and oppression of the people. On September 11th of 2012, in an op-ed in the New York Times, Putin wrote, quote, "And I would rather disagree with the case that President Obama made on American exceptionalism, stating that the United States policy is what makes America different. It's what makes us exceptional." Putin continued, "It is extremely dangerous to encourage people to see themselves as exceptional, whatever the motivation." Now, I'm going to say something that may surprise you. I agree with Mr. Putin. I agree that if you look through the reaches of history, it has been very, very dangerous for tyrants and autocrats and despots when Americans realize we are exceptional and when we stand up and defend liberty, whether it was the tyranny of Nazi Germany that brave American GIs bled to free the world from that oppression, or whether it was the grotesque evil that was Soviet communism, whose gulags murdered millions. And once again, the American people, particularly under the leadership of President Ronald Reagan, stood up, embraced American exceptionalism, and said, we are a nation that recognizes every heart yearns to breathe free. American exceptionalism has caused tyrants to tumble. And so Mr. Putin is right to be nervous about American exceptionalism. And I very much hope President Obama doesn't follow Mr. Putin's advice. Thank you.
Wow. That was an inspirational speech. Can do it again. Our next speaker is Katrina Lantos Swett, my favorite speaker on human rights. This is your third or fourth speech here. Dr. Swett is currently serving as a vice chair of the United States Commission of International Religious Freedom. She established the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice and serves as its president and CEO. And I would add that I'm a lifelong admirer of the late Tom Lantos. The human rights organization is proudly carrying out the unique legacy of Congressman Lantos, the then chairman of the House International Relations Committee, who was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to Congress. In addition to managing the Lantos Foundation, Dr. Swett teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University, my alma mater, and she also taught at the University of Southern Denmark. Her varied professional experiences included working on Capitol Hill as deputy counsel to the Criminal Justice Subcommittee of Senate Judiciary Committee for then Senator Joe Biden, as a consultant to businesses, charitable foundations, political campaigns, and also in the media. From 2003 to 2006, Dr. Lantos Swett served as Director of Graduate Program in Public Policy at the New England College, where she is now serves in College Board of Trustees. She is also a member of Board of HR Anke Human Rights in North Korea and Thomas Lantos Institute in Budapest. Dr. Lantos Swett graduated from Yale University in 1974, and I think this is a typo. It says in the age of 18, and earned her JD at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in 1976, so you would have been 20 when you got your Juris Doctor. She received her PhD in history from University of Southern Denmark and has been married for 31 years to former Congressman and Ambassador Richard Swett, and they are parents of 7 children and 2 grandchildren. She resides in Bowen, New Hampshire. And I must say, I'm always, always personally touched when I hear you speaking about Russia, the Middle East, you name it. Here's the podium, please.
Thank you, Ariel, for that very, very gracious introduction. And, you know, it always feels a little exciting and daring for me to come to the Heritage Foundation because I am a proud Democrat, and so I sort of have to summon up all my courage and chutzpah, if I may say so, to dare to take a podium here. But the simple truth is I have always been greeted with not only unfailing courtesy and kindness and generosity of spirit, but I have often felt, because I am usually invited to speak about the subject of human rights, that in that area at least what binds us together is far more important than what separates us. And I think that's one reason why I do feel very privileged to work in the field of human rights, and because it is one of those areas where we can build bridges between those who may have differences in other arenas. Before I get into my formal remarks, I just need to say a quick word about this moment for me to come and speak here to you about Russia and the state of human rights in Russia. As some of you may know, through the Lantos Foundation and before my father died, he was extremely engaged on behalf of the cause of the man who became Russia's most prominent prisoner of conscience, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who, as some of you may know, was Russia's richest man, its most successful private entrepreneur, and who had attained tremendous heights of success in the post-Soviet period in Russia. But he began to run afoul of President Putin, not because of his great wealth, not because of what he had achieved as a businessman, but when he began to use his power and his influence and his resources to try and bring real democracy to Russia, to begin to become engaged as a philanthropist of a new breed in Russia, as he began to fight for and support genuine democracy, real opposition parties. That is when he suddenly found himself on the receiving end of official persecution and prosecution at the hands of a deeply corrupt judiciary. And for over a decade, he was imprisoned along with his partner, Platon Lebedev. But as I think everybody in this audience at least will know, about a month ago, maybe a little over a month ago, Mikhail Khodorkovsky was released, as was just Friday, I believe, his business partner, Platon Lebedev. I agree entirely with the comments of Senator Cruz that while we welcome and celebrate the release of these 2 prisoners of conscience and these 2 exemplars of what it means to be a victim of an utterly corrupt judicial system, it was not an act of a lawful government acting in accordance with the rule of law. This was a gesture in advance of the Olympics as a means of avoiding the much deserved criticism that otherwise would have been focused in their direction. And so while we welcome and celebrate their release, we do not welcome the circumstances and the nature of the regime that can act arbitrarily to imprison and arbitrarily to release. I also have to say on a personal note that another prisoner who was released in the last handful of weeks was actually a relative of mine. Some of you may recall the that the crew of a Greenpeace ship, the Arctic Sunrise, was arrested and imprisoned as they were preparing to engage in one of their well-known peaceful protests on environmental causes. And the captain of the Greenpeace is a cousin of my husband, Peter Wilcox. So at a very, very personal level, we felt there was a lot to celebrate during this holiday season to see these individuals released. But one always has to be alert to sort of being bought off emotionally. And that's sometimes what dictators like to do. You know, they take hostages, they hold hostages, people become invested, deeply and powerfully and passionately invested in the fate of those hostages, and then, you know, you begin to be drawn into a kind of emotional blackmail as those individuals are released. So I wanted to sort of put that out there at the start. As I say, I'd like to thank my gracious hosts here at Heritage for this wonderful opportunity to address you on human rights in Russia, an especially important issue to highlight given the upcoming Sochi Olympics. With the freezing temperatures here in Washington over the past week, I hope you'll permit me to use an analogy about dressing for cold weather in order to describe my approach to this issue. When temperatures fall and it gets cold, as it has been recently, it reminds us how right our parents were when they implored us to bundle up and put on our hats before going outside. Now, it so happens that when it comes to hats, I've arrived here with not one but two hats, figuratively speaking. Because when it comes to the relationship between Russia's government and human rights, the weather is, I must say, well below freezing. And so with that in mind, the first hat that I'll be wearing today is that of Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. And my other hat will be that of President of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. I'll sort of put on my commission hat for the first part of my remarks when I focus in particular on the religious freedom situation in Russia, and then switch hats to more broadly address some of the other issues. Finally, I guess if I can be permitted one more metaphor on hats, I would like to say that I do tip both of my hats to the people here at Heritage for their firm support of human rights and especially religious freedom across the globe, including in Russia. In the battle of freedom against tyranny, it is good to have allies like Heritage in this noble struggle. Okay, enough with hats. Let's begin with a brief journey to the past, a generation ago in Russia. It's the early to middle 1990s. Against all odds, the Berlin Wall has come down, the Iron Curtain has been rent, and Soviet tyranny is no more. The Kremlin is now the seat of the world's newest experiment in freedom. Fast forward with me, if you will, to 2012, which was a terrible year for Russian civil society. During my visit to Moscow in September of that year on USCIRF's behalf, human rights activists uttered to me these chilling words: Russia is a police state. The obvious question is this: what happened? How did Russia move from bright days that were so filled with promise to today's dark days when Moscow is looking more and more like the Kremlin of old? From a religious freedom standpoint, the seeds were sown as far back as 1997, when Russia passed its law on freedom of conscience, or its religion law. Clearly, this new law represented a retrenchment from Russia's prior and more generous religion law enacted not long after the Soviet Union fell. Despite Russia's constitutional guarantees of equal legal status for every religion, the new religion law created several categories of religious communities, with each having different legal rights and privileges. Each category required that religious organizations exist for different periods of time and have specific numbers of founding members. Moreover, the preface to the law singled out Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and especially Orthodox Christianity as Russia's four traditional faiths, implying favored status for adherents of these religions, rather than equal status for all religions. While the preface to this law lacked legal status, it has set a biased tone for relations with those numerous groups and denominations that fall outside of these four privileged faiths. Besides the 1997 religion law, another factor which set the stage for today's Russia has been the country's extremism laws. Responding to entirely legitimate security concerns about terrorism, Russia, unfortunately, in 2002 passed an extremism law which defines the word extremism in a disturbing way, imposing sanctions on those who promote, quote, the exclusivity, superiority, or inferiority of citizens based on religion. Now, this law is problematic for at least two reasons. First, it targets religious groups that exercise their right to believe and to preach that their own ideas or doctrines are true, while others' ideas or doctrines are false. For anyone familiar with the world of faith and religion, this is a component of that world. Deep convictions and profound beliefs about what it is one adheres to very often involve the assertion, in no way violent, in no way hostile or aggressive, that what we believe is true. And yet this law puts a shadow of illegality over such very common practices. Second, it targets those who do so even if there is not a shred of evidence to suggest that they support violence to promote such beliefs. Penalties under the extremism law can be draconian. Once a higher court upholds a ruling that religious literature is, quote, extremist, the material is banned, with convicted individuals facing penalties ranging from a fine to 5 years in prison. As of December 2013, Russia's list of materials banned as extremist had reached nearly 2,200 items. Taken together, Russia's religion law and its extremism law codify a hierarchy in Russian government and society when it comes to religious groups and their members. For those groups that are not one of the four designated as traditional religions, Russian officials can find numerous ways to violate their freedom. They may obstruct the construction or rental of buildings for worship for groups such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, or Pentecostals. Officials also can initiate court cases that may result in certain communities being banned. While the Salvation Army, certainly a benign organization if ever there was one, was re-registered in Moscow in 2009, it was able to do so only after it litigated all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. Despite that court's decision that Russia's 15-year-old existence rule for registration eligibility violated the European Convention on Human Rights, the fact is that the Church of Scientology, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Armenian Catholics still are being denied registration based on that statute. Now, when it comes to the four so-called traditional religions mentioned in the preface to Russia's religion law, it's obvious that while all are mentioned as if they were equal, some are decidedly more equal than others. As Russia's majority church with a special role in Russia's culture and history, the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church is clearly favored over all others. From religious education to counseling, this church has special arrangements with numerous government agencies. And in many ways, big and small, it exerts tremendous influence over Russian politics, policies, and culture. While the Moscow Patriarchate has exalted status, Russia's Muslim community often is treated as badly as non-traditional communities. For example, Muslims often face hurdles in gaining permits to open mosques. Moscow, for instance, has 2 million Muslims, but only 4 mosques. And in Sochi, the site of the Olympics, the city's 20,000 Muslims repeatedly tried but failed to receive a permit to construct a mosque. And across Russia, Muslims viewed as overly observant have been subjected to arrests, disappearances, and even murder for alleged religious extremism. Across the North Caucasus, Chechny's Kremlin-appointed president, Ramzan Kadyrov, condones or oversees massive human rights and religious freedom violations. He and his militia long have practiced collective punishment and instituted a repressive state based on his views. In late 2013, the Chechen First Deputy Interior Minister told Chechen officials that Kadyrov had given him a free hand to plant false evidence and to arrest, imprison, and execute without trial anyone who either looks remotely like an Islamic militant or criticizes local authorities. So it should come as no surprise that according to Human Rights Watch, the European Court of Human Rights had issued more than 210 rulings against Russia for major human rights violations during its counterinsurgency campaign in Chechnya. In addition, Muslims remain deeply affected by Russia's extremism law. When a court in 2007 banned Russian translations of 14 Quranic commentaries by Turkish theologian Said Nursi, legitimate security needs definitely were not the real issue. Instead, the issue was Nursi stating what people of nearly every belief system say, that their ideas are superior to those of others. The ban on Nursi texts is among a series of sweeping prohibitions of Islamic materials that have been implemented under the extremism law. In Russia's largest ever single ban on religious texts, an Orenburg court in March of 2012 declared 68 Islamic texts extremist, including books approved by Russia's official Council of Muftis and printed by all of Russia's officially sanctioned Islamic publishers. Responding to this court order, the Council of Muftis rightly noted that this ruling constituted, and I quote, the revival of total ideological control, which is unacceptable in a democratic society. While most religious materials banned under the extremist laws are Islamic, Russia also has used the law to target non-Muslim groups such as the pacifist Jehovah's Witnesses and the Church of Scientology. As of 2013, courts had deemed 68 Jehovah's Witness texts extremist, and Jehovah's Witnesses face prosecution for possessing so-called extremist literature. I will say that I have read this so-called extremist literature for myself, and it's absurd. The designation is absolutely absurd. In August of 2013, a court in the city of Tver declared the Jehovah's Witnesses' international website to be extremist because it contained phrases from previously banned Jehovah's Witnesses brochures, such as, "What does the Bible teach?" Just last week, the Tver Regional Court overturned this decision, averting the embarrassment of Russia's becoming the only world nation to ban the Jehovah's Witnesses website. As many have noted, as religious freedom goes, so go other freedoms, including the freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. Indeed, in a very real way, freedom of religion or belief is the great wellspring from which other liberties flow. So we should not be surprised that, especially under Vladimir Putin, religious freedom violations are coupled with the abridgments of other fundamental liberties. When I was in Moscow in late September of 2012, I met with 30 civil society and religious community leaders and journalists. Each one believed that Russia was on the cusp of a new Cold War on civil society. Indeed, in response to public protests against the validity of Putin's election, the government crackdown has included tactics that Russia has not seen since the old Soviet days of Leonid Brezhnev. As part of the crackdown, the government arrested hundreds of protesters in Bolotnaya Square, including Sergei Udaltsov, an opposition leader accused of organizing the demonstrations, and Mikhail Kozenko, who, in a chilling throwback to the Soviet era, was sentenced to indefinite psychiatric treatment. It has also enacted a series of laws curtailing freedom of expression, association, and assembly, including a blasphemy law, which impacts religious freedom as well. The new restrictions began in June 2012 when Putin signed a law that included a 100-fold increase, more than the average Russian's annual salary, in fines for unauthorized protests. In July of 2012, Putin signed legislation requiring foreign-funded non-governmental organizations, NGOs, involved in, quote, political activity, to register as foreign agents. Might as well just put on a sign saying traitor, spy, enemy of Russia. You know, that designation is an unacceptable one. Or face massive fines or 2-year jail terms for their leaders. Tellingly, most of Russia's human rights NGOs rely on some form of outside financial support. They have refused to obey this new law and plan to appeal it to the European Court for Human Rights. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because I, like some of our other speakers, have gotten the little signal from Ariel. Let's see. Last year, just to give you some other examples to get a sense of the state of human rights and freedom in Russia, the respected French NGO Reporters Without Borders ranked Russia at 148, with 173 being the lowest ranking, for its dismal dismal record on protecting, for example, freedom of the press. The organization noted that Russia's ranking has continued to fall due to increased repression of dissent since Putin's return to the presidency. Moreover, the Kremlin has failed to punish those who have murdered or assaulted journalists. Indeed, since 1993, 56 journalists have been killed, many of whom were reporting on the continued violence in the North Caucasus. And just last month, the Kremlin refused to extend the Russian visa of David Satter, a very distinguished American journalist who I know has spoken here at the Heritage Foundation on various occasions, and he's also a well-known critic of the Kremlin. Along with its continued stance against independent-minded media, in 2013, the Putin government also followed up on the Foreign Agents Law by mounting an unprecedented campaign against NGOs accused of not registering as foreign agents. In January of last year, a new law was passed which imposed harsher jail terms for extremism. 2 months ago, in November of 2013, Putin signed another law requiring close relatives and acquaintances of alleged terrorists to pay damages while empowering officials to seize property from friends and relatives of suspected militants. It's quite a bill of attainder against this Putin regime, and in the interest of time, I will not be able to speak about each and every one of the retreats from democracy and rule of law that we've seen in Russia over the last several years, but it is a long and disturbing list. I will mention one more. Last but hardly least, on the same day that Putin signed a new blasphemy law, now that's moving in the right direction, isn't it, folks, on religious freedom, he also approved a measure which banned so-called public propaganda in favor of homosexuality. This law has triggered calls to boycott the Sochi Games, and protests are expected during the upcoming Olympics. As we approach the eve of the Olympics, one thing is unmistakably obvious. Russia's leaders have no intention of ceasing their assaults on civil liberties, be it freedom of conscience and religion, or of expression, association, and assembly. Indeed, the Kremlin seems convinced that if Russia is to maintain both cultural cohesion and basic security, the freedoms that Russians enjoyed following the Soviet Union's demise must be curtailed. I've tried to show this morning just how far the Kremlin is willing to go in rolling back basic liberties. For the sake of the deepest values we treasure as a nation, and for the sake of universal standards of international law, we dare not be silent in the face of these abuses. Standing up and speaking out is, for us, a moral imperative. But as I conclude, let me add that it is also a practical necessity. Russia and its leaders don't seem to realize that when you take people's freedoms away, there will be no cultural cohesion or unity, but only chaos, division, and strife. There will be no safety and security, but only more extremism, and I fear more violence and terror. In order to defeat bad ideas, you need to allow a full and free marketplace that includes good ideas. And that is precisely what Putin is opposing, the very thing that can bring more safety and stability to Russia. In other words, the way to defeat terrorism, which is often given as the excuse for these steps, is by preventing people from becoming terrorists in the first place. It is by forcing those who trumpet extremism to defend their ideas against competing beliefs in a noble struggle for the hearts and minds of fellow human beings. And so as I conclude, let me say that with the approach of the Sochi Games, it is our fervent hope and prayer that those games will proceed in safety and security, and that not a single moment will be marred by violence of any kind. But beyond the Olympics, let us rise to the occasion and press Russia's government to return to the pathway of freedom, which in the end is the only guarantor of stability and peace. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a unique opportunity to ask questions, and by that I mean questions, short, to the point. Please introduce yourself. Let's keep it as short as possible so others can ask questions. Yes, the gentleman right here. Yes, please, sir. Wait for the mic. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Dr. Michael Krause. I've been a soldier all my life. 2 wars, 4 continents, 5 contingencies. I see the danger signs of conflict. 1914, 2014. I see the lack of decision making. And first of all, I applaud each one of you today, the moving human rights, the lack of leadership, and then an analysis of Putin. Beautifully done, a rare treat. My question, my observation is you can't lead from behind. I've been able to teach leadership to Americans who still believe in American exceptionalism. Now, the real question of Senator Cruz, will you lead in 2016?
Well, I thank you for your service as a soldier and for your leadership, and I thank you for your very kind question. What I can certainly commit to you is that I intend to do everything I can now and in the years to come to stand up and defend liberty, because I think liberty is imperiled, and I think these are extraordinary times. I think they're extraordinary times domestically. We're not talking about domestic issues right now, but I think we face challenges domestically that go to the ability of the United States to sustain itself and preserve the same opportunity for our children and grandchildren that we've enjoyed. And I think internationally, as the United States recedes, we are seeing Russia expand, we're seeing China expand, we are seeing radical Islamists expand, all at the expense of human freedom, but also both U.S. national security and global security. And so I'll give you my commitment on this, which is I intend to do everything I can to speak out and urge America to lead and to stand for freedom.
Thank you, Senator, and I must add that you're doing it better than most people I know. I will not specify. I would like to recognize my friend, the Ambassador of Georgia. Thank you, Your Excellency, for being here with us. Georgia, by the way, is and was at the forefront of fighting for freedom, for its independence, and we here at the Heritage Foundation in the last 20 years did a lot to support the independence of Georgia throughout these challenging years. Next question, please. The gentleman right here, yes. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Lex McCusker. I'd like to stir the pot a little bit with a question for Mr. Belovsky. You described Vladimir Putin as a complete tactician. Doesn't know what he's going to do next month, let alone next year, without strategic intent. Senator Cruz, on the other hand, laid out a vision of Mr. Putin trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. Who's right?
I think I'm right.
Is that a religious statement?
Yeah.
He's also modest.
You know, I haven't seen any, the ideas of reassembling of the Soviet Union had been very popular 15 years ago, 10 years ago, but they are quite unpopular now. And it's certainly something that Vladimir Putin deserved. And the so-called customs union has nothing to do with the Soviet Union as any kind of group of states united by the general goal. You know, the general goal, the common goal of the Soviet republics was the creation of communism. Then it's become evident the idea of communism and the communism project for the humanity failed, as it's become evident in the late 1980s. So the Soviet Union has lost any sense of its existence. And that, in my opinion, rather than the oil prices, led to the disassembling of Soviet Union and cost which will be observed in the late 1980s with this former superpower, where I was born many years ago. And the customs union for Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan has no distinct and obvious concept, and even more, it lacks any technological understanding how it should be done. And the money injected by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine led not to bringing Ukraine closer to Russia, but in my opinion, vice versa. It led to the growing irritation of the active parts of Ukrainian society toward Russia, and to the further alienation of all thinking and politically active people in Ukraine from Russia. So actually, Vladimir Putin invested in Ukrainian revolution, but not in bringing Ukraine into the customs union. And Ukraine is as far from any form of interstate integration with Russia as it has never been for the past 20 years.
Stas, okay, let's
Yes,
move
so
on with the
I'm
questions here,
finishing.
please.
So I think Putin has no concept of any reassembling of the Soviet Union, has no such strategy, but certainly he thinks of what would be written about him in Russian history textbook, and if there would be just one phrase about customs union as a success, he would be very satisfied by that.
Well, beyond the customs union, of course, there's Eurasian Union, of which we here at the Heritage Foundation published papers. You're welcome to look on the web, and we also conducted conferences on the same subject of the Eurasian Union. Senator, would you like to add something?
You know, I'll make a quick point, which is that I don't know that the two are inconsistent. That one can be a tactician responding to opportunity and at the same time have an overarching objective. You know, I drew an analogy to playing chess. Many top chess players, when a piece is challenged and under threat, rather than necessarily defend that piece, will press forward and attack. And will press forward and attack in one direction, in another direction, and wait for their opponent to make a mistake, to make an error, and then press that advantage. I think what you see with Putin's Russia is a consistent objective of expanding Russian power and influence and restoring what I think Putin views as the glory days, when the Soviet Union was one of two global superpowers. And does that mean there is a master plan at every stage 20 moves down the road? Not necessarily. Some of it is responding to opportunity, pressing here where you can, pressing there where you can, and when you see weakness, stepping in. So with Ukraine, I think you see a pushing move to integrate and bring Ukraine as much as possible back under Russian domination. But the protests on the street were not anticipated. I'm certainly not contending that Putin has thought through every step, and it's actually that spark of human freedom and independence, the courage of people to stand up and demand freedom, that has the way of throwing an obstacle in the plans of restoring domination. But I would note, on the flip side, the example of pressing and stepping in for opportunity. We see Syria as a perfect example of that, where Syria, with Russia's blessing, has pursued chemical weapons, has pursued a brutal civil war, Assad against his own people, murdering over 100,000. And yet, when President Obama announced a policy for which there was no support and was clearly boxed in by having not thought through the course of action, Putin swept in opportunistically and offered, well, let me rein in Assad. Well, how kind of him. I think that's a perfect example, going back to the chess analogy, of pressing, and there's a weakness, fine, we'll step in and I'll show how magnanimous I am being. And I think the overall objective of expanding their sphere of influence and power is not at all inconsistent with being opportunistic and responding to circumstances in a way, quite frankly, that our foreign policy is failing to do.
And of course, they swept in a whole country, Armenia, that just joined the customs union and is on the way to join the Eurasian Union, when everybody expected, including our own State Department, that Armenia will sign, just like Ukraine would sign, the association agreement with the EU. Oops. Dr. Swett, Lantos Swett.
I'll just add another thought, which is that I think the reason, perhaps that Putin doesn't have this grand strategic vision is that his goals are very narrow. It isn't a grand ideology. It's no longer a battle between different worldviews. It's about power and strength and the restoration of a perceived lost glory, although it's a very odd way to restore glory through such brutal and anti-democratic means. But I think that that's really the key here, is there is no ideological vision. It is about power. But I think we should bear in mind, in fact, I think it was former President Bill Clinton who said, sometimes it's better to be strong and wrong than being perceived as weak and right. And that's what, above all, we must avoid in this new dance between the United States, which does have profound values, and we need to lead from our strength. Our strength is that we are guided by principles, by value, by a passionate commitment to democracy and fundamental human rights. And as a human rights person, I hope and pray that we don't sacrifice those on any altar, because I think that is where our strength in this confrontation lies. That is where we bring the stronger hand, but we have to play that hand.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are over time. We'll take a quick technical break, and we will reconvene here in about 10 minutes for our following panel. Thank you all for being here with us so far, and please stay for more analysis from the Heritage Foundation.
All right, if everyone will take their seats. I still have one panelist doing an interview, but you've already talked to him, so he can come in when he gets here. Okay, to anyone who just came in on the streaming video, welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Dr. Steve Bucci. I'm the director of the Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. We have part 2 of our Russia event today. We were treated a little earlier to a great trio of speakers who laid down a foundation as to what's going on in Russia and what it may mean. Now we have 4 more speakers that are going to go a little bit shorter than the others and then get a little more time for Q&A, I hope. And I'm going to give very short introductions and then let them use up the time for their actual remarks. First, we're going to have Elon Bergman, who is the Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. He has been an advisor to both the intelligence community and to the Department of Defense. He's written numerous books, but I'm just going to mention 2 of them because they sort of apply to this particular subject. His earliest book was Dismantling Tyranny, Transitioning Beyond Totalitarian Regimes. But his most recent book picked up the subject, and it's called Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. So very timely to have him here. We also have Vladimir Kara-Muza, who is the Senior Policy Advisor at the Institute of Modern Russia. He has served for a long time as the Washington Bureau Chief of RTVI Television, and is a member of the Coordinating Council of the Russian Opposition. In between them is Donald Jensen, and I surprised Ariel because I didn't tell him I was going to start. You're down on the end, Ariel. Donald Jensen is a resident fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations, but he is a long time member of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He is a frequent commentator on radio and television in the U.S., Russia, Canada, Europe, and the Middle East. So he's got quite a deep view of this area for a long time. And then you met earlier my colleague here at Heritage, Dr. Ariel Cohen, who is our Russia-Eurasia specialist senior fellow. He's been here at Heritage since 1992, got his education both at Tufts University, but also many years in Israel, and he is our major commentator on all things Russia, the former Soviet Union, both their politics, economics, energy, and he is our lead man for dealing with the issues that have been coming up most closely related to Sochi. With that, I'm going to stop. We're going to speak for approximately 10 minutes. I'll give you maybe a couple minutes over if you get a little too much, but then I'll start waving my arms, and we'll go from this end down and end with Dr. Cohen, and then we'll go into Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Elon.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be at Heritage. It's always a pleasure to come back and talk. This is perhaps not the cheeriest subject to talk about, in part because I tend to have a very pessimistic view of the Sochi Olympics and sort of all of the security dynamics that are relating to it for a number of reasons, which I'll mention. First of all, I think it's necessary to posit that the security situation in Sochi surrounding the Olympics is tenuous at best. Mike Rogers, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, recently commented that the security environment in Sochi is the most fraught, the most difficult, and the most volatile that he's seen in his memory in terms of previous Olympiads. And there's a reason for that. I think he's absolutely right. But it has to do with a number of systemic dynamics that have been going on in Russia for a long time, but are really only now coming to the fore. We know that the Olympics are in the crosshairs of Russia's most organized and most capable Islamist group. This is an organization known as the Caucasus Emirate. The Caucasus Emirate is an al-Qaeda affiliate. It is an organization which has also articulated a vision that is far greater than simply the liberation of Chechnya, Dagestan, and Ingushetia and the North Caucasus. It has articulated the liberation of those areas of the Russian Federation as a prelude to the establishment of a Central Asian caliphate. So in a very real sense, they have coupled themselves to the larger al-Qaeda ideology of sort of the expansion of Islamist and Islam in various parts of the world. In particular, Doku Umarov, the emir of the Caucasus Emirate, has talked, and there are rumors that Umarov has exited the political stage courtesy of the Russian Special Forces, but I think reports of Umarov's death are going to turn out to be greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain would say. When he was alive and kicking, if he's not anymore, Umarov talked a great deal about how the Olympiad, the Sochi Olympics, are satanic games because they are dancing on the bones of his ancestors, or the athletes will be competing on the bones of his ancestors, and have called for attacks targeting the Olympics. But at the core, this isn't so much an ideological play as it is a pragmatic and opportunistic one. We saw the start of this already several weeks ago with the attacks that took place, the near simultaneous attacks that took place on a bus and in the main train station of Volgograd. In part because Volgograd is an important transport hub that will be ferrying people to the Olympics. And it was a place that was, up until that time, outside of the security zone that the Russian government had established. So it was vulnerable. It was low-hanging fruit. But beyond that, you see reports coming out of Sochi, as conveyed by Western news agencies, about desperate hunts on the part of security services for black widows, who are the spouses of Islamic militants from the North Caucasus who have been killed in terrorist attacks that are now in play. There's at least one that is believed to be in Sochi. I suspect the number is far higher. But it shows you that the security environment is very volatile. It's one that, frankly, should be keeping Russian policymakers up at night. There has been an overwhelming governmental response to this. Putin has established a security corridor spanning 1,500 miles, so to include Volgograd, which is about 450 miles as the crow flies. There are mobility restrictions on everybody coming to Sochi, but some people more than others, including Islamic communities in the region. There are transportation choke points. There is a massive saturation of security forces into the region. 40,000 troops have been officially deployed. There are more that are related not to the Russian military, that are related to the security services that have been authorized to travel to the region as well. But the fundamental problems, and this is, I think, necessary to understand in the context of a response to what they see as a potential security threat in Sochi. But the Russian government really hasn't done much to address the underlying issues that have created the security threat in the first place. And what we're talking about here is, first of all, there has been a colossal dereliction of duty, fiscal and political duty, on the part of the Russian government in building the Sochi Olympics. Vladimir Putin, when he lobbied successfully 6.5 years ago to have Sochi be the site of the Olympics, he beat out a site in South Korea, he beat out a site in Austria, and he did so because he promised he was going to spend an exorbitant amount on the Olympics. But the exorbitant amount that he cited to the Olympic Committee was $12 billion. The price tag, right, so Ariel left. Right, the price tag for the Olympics now is way higher. It is, depending on your estimates, anywhere from $50 billion on up. I've seen estimates as high as $55 billion. And at least a third of that money, according to reports from credible Russian observers, has been lost to corruption. The result is that the basic things that needed to be done to get Sochi ready and to get Sochi secure for the Olympics simply haven't been done. For example, comparatively modest investments in infrastructure, rail infrastructure, air infrastructure, that would have allowed transport hubs to accommodate a greater volume of passengers simply weren't done. The reason the Caucasus Emirates, we believe, targeted Volgograd was because, quite frankly, Volgograd is a major transit corridor to get to Sochi, and it's one that retains its importance because there haven't been ancillary roads built, ancillary means of transport built. Great thought exercise for all of you, if you're interested, is to go on the internet and Google flying distance and driving distance from Volgograd to Sochi. As the crow flies, Volgograd is 420 miles from Sochi. As the car drives, it's 615 miles because the terrain is very difficult, because there are mountains, because you have to sort of loop around, and it is a testament to the fact that there wasn't a lot of thought given beyond the prestige and the glory of Sochi itself. There wasn't a lot of thought given to the practicalities that would involve hosting an international event like this, and there certainly weren't any investments. And so what is the strategic significance of this? And I think that there's a couple of really important takeaways. The first is, for my money, that the dominant Russian narrative that essentially that Russia has fought, and contrary to the West, Russia has fought and won its own war on terror, frankly, that's pretty premature. And here you have to, I think, parse the statistics. Tactically, the Kremlin has some basis for saying so. If you look at the State Department's annual reports on international terrorism, they're called the country reports on terrorism, you'll find that in terms of terrorist attacks in Russia, 2009 was the high water mark. There were close to 800 incidents in the Russian Federation, most of them in the North Caucasus, in that year alone. Last year, in 2012, which is the last year for which they have complete statistics, the number was less than 200. So numerically, Russia is winning its war on terror. But what these statistics don't account for is that strategically, it's not. Strategically, the radical Islamic threat in Russia is still resilient. It's actually expanding, and it's changing. It's metastasizing in terms of its tactics and in terms of its volatility. And you see this through, for example, the use of female suicide bombers, which is a comparatively new phenomenon. You see this through the use of different targeting techniques, different explosives. And most of all, this is reinforced by negative demographic trends in Russia as a whole. The backdrop to all this is that while Russia's population as a whole is declining, the Muslims in Russia are faring comparatively well. Today, Russian Muslims make up 16% of the overall population, but by the end of the decade, 1 in 5 Russians is going to be Muslim, according to some trend lines. And beyond that, it you get closer and closer to parity. And as a result, what you have is you have an underclass which is, as you heard the previous panel talk about, discriminated against by the Russian government. There is not a real cohesive strategy on the part of the Russian government to integrate, to empower, to provide economic opportunities to. But it's also a community that, as it's being deprived of opportunity, it's expanding and it's also radicalizing. So this is the fundamental problem that the Russian government has. And unfortunately, the trend line over the last several years has been that they've learned exactly the wrong lessons. When the Kremlin looks at the numbers of terrorist attacks and the decline from nearly 800 in 2009 to less than 200 last year, or a year and a half ago, it can say that it's winning. But this hard power strategy is, I think, only a tactical success. It's a strategic failure because it fails to take into account the dynamics that are taking place within the Russian Muslim population itself. And that gets us to sort of what we can expect to see. I think all of us share the view that we fervently hope that nothing untoward happens at the Olympics, that the Olympics are safe, that they're secure, that there are no violations of rights, that there are no terrorist attacks, and there's no criminality. But if you are looking at it through the prism of a strategic analyst, you have to understand that the reason the House Intelligence Committee chairman is so concerned is because he understands that the Islamist threat in Russia is resilient, he understands that it's dynamic, and he understands that it's opportunistic, which means that if you're the Caucasus Emirate, you want, if you have the ability to do so, to make a play at the Olympics for two reasons. First of all, because the ability to carry off a terrorist attack in the midst of this massive security cordon, in the midst of this massive injection of Kremlin attention and Kremlin infrastructure and Kremlin restrictions on mobility, is a blow to the perceived invulnerability of the Kremlin. It's a prestige killer. And on the other hand, because when the Kremlin devotes so much attention to Sochi, it leaves itself vulnerable elsewhere, which means that it's very possible that a terrorist attack in Russia, we think, will be directed at Sochi, but it may not be directed at Sochi. It may be directed elsewhere, places like Volgograd. Let's remember, Volgograd is the most recent one, but there have been attacks all over, including in Moscow. This is a target-rich environment, particularly for Islamists who more and more are migrating from the North Caucasus into the Russian heartland. So I'll leave it there, but I think there are real reasons for concern about the security environment, and they are because of larger systemic issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Donald?
Thank you. I'm used to Ariel being on this side, handing me those little messages. So
Sorry, I didn't get any messages.
You've removed the terror, and thank you for...
You were about to, but you made it under the wire.
Ariel, thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to speak here at Heritage, and thank you to Ariel, Mr. Bucci, Ilan, and Led. Good to see all of you again. Ariel asked me to talk a little bit about corruption in Sochi, which is a very interesting question to say the least. We had a discussion around coffee yesterday in my office about what's the most corrupt institution in the world: the Ukrainian government, the Russian government, the International Olympic Committee, or the International Soccer Federation, and I'm willing to entertain a debate online anytime. At the risk of some stereotype, I'd like to say, when I think of these Olympic Games going back to when I was a child, for me there's a stereotype, a simple image, often reflecting the country that sponsors them. Lillehammer's kind of Nordic seriousness and effectiveness, Innsbruck's Austrian elegance, Sapporo's quiet dignity, my own Squaw Valley in California, kind of an arrival of California as an international winter destination. But I think for us, of course, Sochi will stand for something quite different. Security concerns, as Ilan mentioned, human rights violations, and I invite anybody to look at what's going on in the North Caucasus for that. And third, massive, massive corruption, perhaps to the extent that even dwarf the International Soccer Federation. It's important before I begin, however, to remember the changed context between 2007, when the Kremlin bribed the International Olympic Committee to get the Games, and today. Then Putin wanted to buy himself into the club of world leaders. He was much more interested in engaging with the West, engaging with international institutions in a more constructive way. Today, of course, he's trying to construct, in his own mind at least, an alternative civilization that rejects Western values as being decadent, that has the so-called Eurasian dream or project as reflecting an alternative vision of authoritarian regimes ramming through modernization, and in the last few months at least, overlaying upon it an ideological set of values which somehow portrays the East, China, Iran, and elsewhere as more something, but not Western in the least, which has become decadent. Hence the focus on the LGBT issue at the Games. But I want to say a few words about corruption in the Games. In fact, here too, it tends to reflect the regime which is sponsoring them. First is, of course, the gargantuan nature of the Olympic project in Sochi. It is huge and includes, for those of you who are familiar with arguments about building football stadiums or baseball stadiums in the U.S., a lot of ancillary infrastructure issues. There is a palace, a residence for Putin, I almost said palace. There is a huge number of stadiums that will rarely, if ever, be used after this. But there's also a fantasy part of it. The mayor of Sochi earlier this week said there are no gay people in Sochi, which may be the case, but most likely they are elsewhere or driven out or are still there. Second is, of course, the fact that behind the gargantuan nature of this project is, of course, a lot of what those of us who are students of Soviet history see a lot of, which is a very weak infrastructure background. I have a quote here from an Australian journalist yesterday who talked about the dodgy construction, poor accommodations, questionable employment conditions. The toilet flushes muddy water. There is no hot water. The shower floors are covered with dirt and mud, and so forth and so forth. And some of you may have seen the two toilets next to each other last week going viral. Perhaps all this will be cleaned up in the next week and a half. But these things are vulnerable to a lot of forces. And finally, of course, the whole project is highly corrupt. I recommend 50, 55 billion, whatever it is. I highly recommend the project that our Boris Nemtsov and colleagues, including Vlad, put together a few years ago. Alexei Navalny has a corruption website just up, I think, this week, the last few days. And it's huge. We're talking about bribes, cost overruns, work delays, poor construction, and so forth and so forth, on a scale that that dwarfs really anything we really see very often in the West. Excuse me. But three things are noteworthy about this corruption, I think. First is that there's been very little debate about this in Russia till very recently. The Duma and whoever provides a lot of the money, and it's not clear in many cases, there's been very little public discussion about it. Second would be that the interaction between government, private business, to the extent that business in Russia is private, and law enforcement authorities is completely blurred. If you try to look at where the money comes from, it's either the budget or the VEB Bank or the VEB Bank guaranteeing loans to the Olympic project, and so forth and so forth. There's a blend of power and money that we see in many other things about Putin's Russia. And third, I would say, and it's something that's not covered very often at all, the corruption and money and issues related to this goes down very much to the local level, in Sochi and Krasnodar and so forth. And so the problem is not just at the top. The problem is too much of everything going down to the project, to the very local levels, which has implications for guaranteeing the effectiveness and safety of the regime itself. We can talk more about this. Excuse me. In recent weeks, Putin has sort of acknowledged that there might be a little problem with some cost overruns. The Yada Chamber talked about mistakes were made and it cost a little bit too much, as if it was building a new Redskins stadium, which is not the case. Putin himself talked a little bit about it in the last couple of weeks. Why? Because the issue of corruption in Russia has a great deal of resonance, even with the growing number of dismayed Russian citizens. This comes in the context of a more broad anti-corruption campaign, where Putin is trying to show that he's doing something about it, putting his trusted lieutenant Sergei Ivanov in charge of the anti-corruption campaign, cracking down on a few people that makes the campaign look serious, and of course, over the past 14 months or so, trying to get some of his oligarch friends to bring some of their overseas assets home. I suspect the reason is less to do with cleaning up the government than making them less vulnerable to Western law enforcement authorities or making them back under control. I'm about at 8 minutes now. I think it's very important, again, something we haven't talked about very much, is what happens after Sochi. Sochi, in many ways, is a temporary stop on a number of processes going on in the system, which I think bear further attention. Number one would be, as said earlier this morning, there have been a number of carefully designated signs that Putin is liberalizing the system, which he isn't particularly very much at all, Khodorkovsky, Lebedev's release, and so forth. But also, the Sochi events may have even postponed a more overt and serious Russian dealing with the Ukrainian situation, because the Russians don't want to look on the eve of the games like things are happening that they're trying to orchestrate or influence in a significant way. But after the Sochi games, of course, there remain these problems, the systemic corruption, the fact that what will the attitude of the West be toward Putin after the games. There is a G8 meeting in June, I believe, which will be at Sochi. There will be an invitation to President Obama extended to meet, and that's already been talked about by Lavrov and some other Russian officials. So this is a chance for the United States to be upfront once the games are out of the way, much more assertive, as the Senator said this morning, and it's a chance for Putin to be tested about whether his commitment to an anti-corruption campaign has really any meat there at all, and I suspect it doesn't beyond the cosmetic.
Thank you very much. Vladimir?
Thank you very much, Mr. Bucci, and thank you especially to the Heritage Foundation for hosting this very timely event, as we're now just a week away from the official opening of the 22nd Winter Olympic Games in Sochi. And as has been mentioned both in the morning panel and by my colleagues here now, it has been the most, or it will be the most important, the most expensive Winter Olympic Games in history, and it costs more than the combined price tag of all Winter Olympic Games since their inception in 1924. And I think the estimates provided by my fellow panelists today are somewhat conservative, because in the expert report that you, Don, mentioned, co-authored by Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, which will be, by the way, presented for the first time in the English language this week in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, it was estimated that up to $30 billion was stolen during the construction of Olympic projects. Only stolen. That's not the price. That's only the corruption part of it. And also this week, our own institute, the Institute of Modern Russia, is launching its own Sochi anti-corruption project, which is called Sochi 2014, the reverse side of the medal, which provides information, detailed information on 26 specific different Olympic objects in and around Sochi, based on exclusive information done for us by investigative journalists based inside Sochi, and all the corruption and abuse that entailed. And of course, it goes beyond just financial abuse. There's been numerous cases of the mistreatment of construction workers, mistreatment and forced evictions of local residents, severe environmental and architectural abuse, and many other similar unfortunate instances. But I think it's really important, as the world focuses its attention on Russia as we approach the Sochi Games, to look beyond Sochi and to look at the overall landscape, the overall situation in the host country. And that situation and that landscape, of course, includes elections that fail to meet the most basic democratic standards, where opposition parties and candidates are routinely barred from the ballot, where despite the promises made after the 2011-2012 mass protests of so-called liberalization, opposition parties continue to face tremendous pressure from the Kremlin. Just 2 weeks ago, Alexei Navalny's party has received its third denial of registration from the Ministry of Justice, which is equivalent to denial of ballot access. And in the next couple of weeks, Russia's only real registered opposition party, the Republican Party of Russia, RPR Parnas, will face a Kremlin-instigated takeover attempt. It is, of course, a landscape that includes Kremlin control and Kremlin censorship over every single national television channel, a situation that includes tremendous pressure and harassment of non-governmental organizations, as Katrina Lantos mentioned this morning. Russian NGOs are faced to accept a slanderous label of, quote, foreign agents, or face forced dissolution, like the Golos Association, the Vote Monitoring Association, which is, of course, the biggest problem, the biggest troublemaker for the regime, which was forcibly shut down by the Russian Justice Ministry just last summer for refusing to accept itself as, quote, foreign agent, which of course it is not. And last but certainly not least, it is a landscape that includes today dozens of political prisoners, of people who sit in jails and under house arrest and in pretrial detention centers for the only, quote, crime of having crossed the path of the Kremlin regime. Despite the high-profile pardons at the end of last year, and of course most prominently the release of Russia's best-known political prisoner for more than a decade, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and last week of another Yukos prisoner, Platon Lebedev, and despite the partial amnesty for some political prisoners, including Greenpeace and Bolotnaya in December. There remain dozens of people who are in Russian prisons on politically motivated grounds. This is what Mikhail Khodorkovsky said 2 days after his own release in December. "You should not see me," I quote, "you should not see me as a symbol that there are no political prisoners left in Russia. I'm asking you to see me as a symbol that the efforts of civil society may lead to the release even of those people whose release was not expected by anyone. We must continue to do all we can to make sure that there are no more political prisoners in Russia, or for that matter, in any other country." End of quote. At the end of last week, the Institute of Modern Russia has launched a new project, Russian Political Prisoners. It includes a full list published on our website, imrussia.org, of 40 people who are designated as political prisoners in Russia today. And this is not what we think, this is not our designation. This is a designation made by Memorial, Russia's most respected human rights organization, founded a quarter century ago by Andrei Sakharov, quarter century ago this week, in fact. The aim of this project is to bring attention, including global attention, to the plight of those people, and to raise awareness and to kind of try to counter this emotional tone that Katrina Lantos also mentioned in her remarks this morning, that if you take hostages and then you release some of them, then the problems are solved and the situation has improved. Unfortunately, despite the limited amnesty and the pardons, which of course are, needless to say, extremely welcome and positive developments, the basic situation remains unchanged. This list of 40 people is based on very stringent, very detailed criteria that have been worked out by Memorial in conjunction with other human rights groups in Central and Eastern European countries. And it's certainly not an expansive list. As Memorial leaders themselves say, that there are probably more than 40 political prisoners in Russia. And in fact, this list does not include, for example, Sergei Makhnatkin, who is in prison now, or rather in pretrial detention for having taken part in a December 31st rally in support of the freedom of assembly. Because all the legal procedures have not been completed yet, he is not on the list. And neither on the list is Yevgeny Vitishko, an environmental activist from the Krasnodar region, a prominent critic of the abuses and corruption in the Sochi Olympics, who was given a 3-year jail term for writing a political slogan on the fence of the dacha of Krasnodar regional governor, one of the most corrupt governors in Russia, Alexander Tkachov. He's awaiting appeal. He's not in jail yet. His appeal is coming in the next few days, and I think it's really important that people and civil society activists, especially in Western democracies, focus their attention on this case. But this list of 40 people that's been published by us and by Memorial includes cases that are beyond doubt as to their political motivation. It includes Mikhail Kosenko, one of the Bolotnaya prisoners, who was sentenced to forced psychiatric treatment in the first case of punitive psychiatry since the days of the Soviet regime. It includes Leonid Razvozhaev, a Russian left-wing opposition activist, who, in a true throwback to Stalin's time, was kidnapped on the sovereign territory of Ukraine, forcibly brought back to Russia and tortured for 2 days into signing a, quote, confession. And he is now in prison awaiting trial. And of course, this list includes, in fact, about a third of the political prisoners on the list are the prisoners of the Bolotnaya Square case. These are the people, again, whose only, quote, crime included taking part in a peaceful protest against Putin's inauguration after a rigged and falsified presidential election in the spring of 2012. As the Soviet-style show trial in the Bolotnaya case is nearing an end, the state prosecutors have demanded 5 to 6 year prison terms for those prisoners, and the verdict is coming out in the next 10 days. The charge they face is riots, despite the fact that the Kremlin's own Human Rights Council, the Russian Presidential Human Rights Council, has concluded that no riots took place on Bolotnaya. While a public independent investigation commission, which included prominent respected academics, experts, civil rights leaders in Russia, including, for instance, Evgeny Yasin, a prominent economist, academician Yuri Ryzhov, the writer Vladimir Vainovich, the late Natalia Gorbanevskaya, a towering figure in the Soviet and Russian human rights movement. This commission, after going through hours of video evidence, hundreds of photographs, hours of eyewitness testimonies, concluded that what happened in Bolotnaya Square was a deliberate provocation by the authorities, by law enforcement, in order to create a pretext for a subsequent crackdown on the opposition and on civil society, which is certainly what we saw with the slate of repressive laws passed after the Bolotnaya Square incident that we heard about this morning. So as we keep in mind the situation with political prisoners, I think it would only be fair to agree with the assessment of Human Rights Watch, which described the situation with human rights in Russia today as, quote, the worst since the Soviet era, end of quote. I think it is difficult to disagree with that assessment. But I think we would also be amiss if we did not talk about a different aspect of what's happening in Russia today. And that is a tangible change in society and in public attitudes that we've seen in the last couple of years. We've seen in the last 2 years, since December of 2011, tens of thousands of people come out on the streets of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other large Russian cities in what were the largest street demonstrations in Russia since August 1991, protesting against the election fraud, the corruption, the injustice, the deception, the repression of the Putin regime. And the backbone of this new emerging protest movement has been Russia's growing urban middle classes, the more active, the young and the more professional part of society. Even according to the official results of the 2012 so-called presidential election, Putin lost majority support and fell below the 50% line in Moscow, in Kaliningrad, in Vladivostok, in Omsk, in Vladimir, and in other towns and cities across Russia. These are the official results put out by the Kremlin's Electoral Commission. We do not know what the real results were. A poll published just this month by the Levada Center polling agency showed that only 22% of Russians want Putin to remain as president beyond the end of his current term. And I would argue these are not very impressive figures for a regime that controls every single national television station. And of course, just this fall in September, we saw a round of regional elections in Russia, where Alexei Navalny, the opposition candidate, received nearly 30% of the vote, even according to the official results in Moscow, where Boris Nemtsov won in Yaroslavl, where opposition mayoral candidates won in Yekaterinburg and Petrozavodsk, not to mention many other local and municipal successes. The election round that finally put a rest to the Kremlin's long-time myth that the Russian opposition is a marginal group with no public support and that apparently there is no alternative to Mr. Putin. Russian society is changing, attitudes are changing, and it is of course only up to Russian citizens and to them alone to effect democratic changes in our country. But I think if the democracies of the West, of Europe and North America, want to show that these values of democracy and human rights and civil society and the rule of law of which they talk are more than just words on paper and that they actually mean something, I think they should not remain silent. They should tell the crooks and the abusers, those who violate the rights and steal the money of Russian citizens, that they are not welcome in the nations of the democratic West. And do this by passing and fully implementing measures such as the Magnitsky Law, both here and in the European Union states. And it should also do this by refusing to lend Putin's regime the international legitimacy and the international respect that it so desperately craves, and that in my view does not deserve. It's clear that for Putin, the Sochi Olympics, it's needless to say, it's not about sport. It's about a show of respect from the free world for him as an equal, as a leader of an equal standing. And it's very encouraging that, at least from today's point of view, he will probably not get that show of respect, at least not to the extent that he wanted, after we've heard Prime Minister Cameron, President Hollande, President Gauck, President Obama, and many other world leaders indicating that they will not go either to the opening or to the closing ceremonies of Putin's Olympics in Sochi. And it's heartening to see the success of this civic campaign, which was initiated last fall with the help of members of the European Parliament and with strong support from the Russian opposition and Russian civil society in favor of political non-participation by the leaders of the free world of Western democracies in Putin's Olympic show in Sochi. And I think that is exactly the right message to be sending both to the Kremlin and a message of solidarity to those dozens of political prisoners in the Russian Federation and to all Russian citizens who want a democratic change and a democratic future for their country. Thank you very much once again. Thank you for holding this panel. I'll be happy to take part in the discussion afterwards.
Thank you. And Ariel. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the panelists and for all of you to brave the weather, Russian weather, and come here for this exciting conference. Let's do a quick mental exercise. Let's take Russia as a company or a brand and evaluate it on its performance in the eve of Sochi. The security of operations is questionable. I sincerely hope that no attacks will happen, no attacks will be successful. I pray that no human life will be lost or hurt, but just the cost of security for this operation is exorbitant. And this is not a one-off. This is an ongoing security threat for not just Sochi, but for any other large-scale event or operation in Russia. Secondly, corruption. We already heard that the costs of the Olympics were reported at 12, with the infrastructure that needed to be developed to accompany it. It is between 50 and 60, and there are some analyses and reports from the political opposition and others that 30 billion may be lost to corruption. Now, what you take in a situation like that as a countermeasure to embezzlement or fraud is compliance. Well, let's see what the compliance reports are. There were high-level reports recently that they looked into allegations of fraud and embezzlement, and no actionable findings were found by those who checked. Well, to me, this is just a failure of compliance. So if you take this all together and look at Russia as a brick, which it is, an emerging market, granted emerging market with nuclear weapons, you look at Russia as an energy and natural resources play, and extrapolate lessons learned from Sochi, you recognize the cost of doing business in Russia, and this is also an opportunity for the Russian leadership, an opportunity to improve, an opportunity to open up, an opportunity to boost compliance, an opportunity to engage the opposition, because, by the way, the opposition that my friend Vladimir Kara-Muza, his party, and many others in Russia represent. This is enlightened, democratic, and sane opposition. These are not the extreme left and extreme nationalists and racists that you see engaged in violence and screaming racist slogans in the streets of Moscow. So, unfortunately, you do not discern beyond the laudable release of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Platon Lebedev, the unmentionable punk rock group, and others. You do not discern any effort to broaden the social consensus, the political consensus. You have an ongoing and tough confrontation between Christian Orthodox Slavic Russians and Muslim Russians that my colleague Ilan Berman touched upon. This is a serious systemic problem. It didn't start yesterday. It started over 200 years ago when Russia gradually brought North Caucasus under its military and administrative control, and the problems persisted ever since and resulted in ethnically cleansed parts of North Caucasus. The Cherkess were expelled into the Ottoman Empire and murdered. The Chechens and the Ingush were loaded into cattle cars and sent to North Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Siberia under Stalin. The Crimean Tatars were equally ethnically cleansed by the Stalin regime. And these things have an interesting tendency. They do not disappear and do not go away. So what we have today, as terrifying and despicable as it may be, which is terrorism against civilian population, has its roots in Russian history. I have a paper on the Heritage website from last year and another longer monograph coming on North Caucasus with the U.S. Army War College looking in depth at the military and security aspects and the history of the conflicts in North Caucasus. But as Elon Berman correctly mentioned, this is now a conflict not just in the Russian context, not just in the regional context of North Caucasus, not just in the Russian statewide context, but it has global connections. Just recently, a Salafi cleric by the name of al-Maqdisi issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, justifying, in the retrospect, the attacks in Volgograd and explaining that attacks on Russian civilian population are justified because the aforesaid civilian population is not standing up against the Russian government when it is persecuting Muslims. Therefore, al-Maqdisi says, any Russian citizen, and he doesn't even distinguish, he mentioned Christians, Orthodox, but he doesn't distinguish that probably 20 million Russian citizens who happen to be Muslim, that these civilians, women, children, and elderly, are all halal, all allowed to be murdered in terrorist attacks. Before that, the spiritual guide of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who resides in the Gulf, issued a fatwa or commented that Russia has become the #1 enemy of Muslims and Arabs, meaning the Sunni Muslims, because of its support of the Syrian regime. This kind of attack by not just Salafis, but also by the Muslim Brotherhood, raises a question. Why is it that the Russian government is not seeking more anti-terrorism cooperation with the West? Why is it continuing anti-American propaganda about somehow that we somehow are supportive of the terrorists in Russia, which I personally believe is absolutely not true. The Russian logic is, of course, that if American allies, such as Saudi Arabia or Qatar, are supportive of Sunni radicals in Syria and elsewhere, then by definition we have to be supportive of such Sunni Islamists and radicals in North Caucasus. There is a deep, deep logical and analytical flow with this kind of analysis. So to wrap it up and open for discussion, I would say that Sochi, to me, is an inflection point for Russia. It is a huge test for its leadership, for Mr. Putin, who invested so much in producing and paying for the Sochi Olympics, and of course the Russian people were paying for it because, of course, this was not Mr. Putin's personal money. I think that from here, Russia can go one of 3 ways. One, it can muddle through and continue pretty much along the lines it did so far. Number 2, it can crack down, as a lot of people are afraid it may do, either after Sochi or after the G8 in June, or I think the least possible scenario, it may move towards a systematic reform. I would challenge my colleagues here with a show of hands to see if anybody thinks that Russia is going to move to systematic reforms. In fact, very little of these reforms were tried or at least talked about under the Medvedev administration. And of course, we know what happened next. Nothing. And worse than nothing, there was a crackdown after the Medvedev term. So this is a trying times for Russia. I think these are trying times for us, for the United States. The Obama administration gave Putin a wide berth. We probably were happy. I mean, I was not privy to discussion in the White House, but I'm pretty sure that the Syrian gambit was greeted on the highest level, and the support we saw to it indicates that it was greeted at the highest level by the White House. The approach that G5 plus Germany took on Iran indicates that the White House is willing to work with Russia as well as with our European allies on bringing or trying to bring Iran back into the fold. And we are very limited in a truly minimalist policy on Ukraine and on other countries of the former Soviet Union. The question is this policy working? And if Ukraine is eventually going by the way of the Customs Union and the Eurasian Union, if this is going to be the end of the road or beginning of a new road. Usually, in foreign policy and in strategy, if you successfully, to use Senator Cruz's chess metaphor, you eat one piece, you get your appetite whetted, and you want to eat another piece, and then another piece. And I'm surprised nobody mentioned here the famous saying by Mr. Putin that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a great geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. And you can imply that for Russia, the restoration of some kind of a Union, Soviet or otherwise, will be the great challenge of geopolitics of the 21st century. So this is something I think the United States need to think about, but I do not see evidence that we are thinking about that, let alone doing something about that. And again, this brings me back to Ukraine and to the fact that we barely reacted when Armenia joined the customs union. I think that the discussion of Russian sphere of exclusive interests, as President Medvedev called it, that discussion is lacking in the city. The policy is not formulated. We haven't formulated our national security interests in that part of the world. And again, I think after Sochi, we will see how that particular line of foreign and defense policy is going to develop. I'll leave you with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, Ariel. Tori Newland handed out donuts.
Cookies.
Cookies. That was the policy.
All right, now we have a few minutes for some questions and answers. We have microphones, so when I acknowledge you, please identify yourself, and hopefully within 2 sentences I'll hear a question mark at the end of the second one, and you can, otherwise I'm going to ask you to sit down. This gentleman right in the front here.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Andrew Jensen. I'm currently with Harvard University, priorly with the Department of Defense. I have a question specifically for Mr. Kara-Muza, though I welcome any of your contributions. You referenced the growing domestic dissatisfaction with the Putin administration on behalf of the average Russian citizen. What is your perception of the average Russian citizen's views towards the upcoming Sochi Olympics? Is this, as I'm sure President Putin is hoping, a mark of achievement for his administration? Is it simply a reinforcement of ongoing perceptions of official government corruption? What's your take on the polls?
I think the corruption issue has really been dominating, especially recently, despite obviously the full blackout on the official media and state television channels. Let's not forget that 50% of Russia is now online. Russia is now the largest internet market in Europe, just surpassed Germany a couple of years ago. And if you take Moscow and St. Petersburg, where most of the protests happened and where the most kind of politically active population lives, the internet reach is between 70 and 75%. So that wall of censorship that's been imposed by Putin's government once they got rid of all the independent TV channels by 2003, that wall of censorship is now being breached. just by the natural progress and the advance of technology. So that issue of corruption, although you wouldn't hear a word about it on state television, it's common knowledge. Maybe not the exact figures that we're discussing, maybe not some of the egregious examples, but the general idea that this is all a big festival of corruption. Raspiliada is a Russian word used for it. Raspilit means basically to use state budget money for your own private purposes, I guess to steal, but to use a simple translation. Raspiliada, festival of corruption, that's how it's referred to by, on blogs, in the internet community, in discussions, in what remains of the independent media. That's the major perception of it. So as I mentioned a little earlier, I think Putin's target audience here is the free world, the leaders of the world's democracies, whom he wanted to come to the ceremonies to sit alongside him. He didn't want to sit next to his KGB and oligarch friends. He wanted to sit with Angela Merkel, with Barack Obama, with Francois Hollande. It looks like they're not coming this time. So his goal in that sense was not fulfilled. But his domestic audience is certainly not, the domestic audience is not his target audience for Sochi. And since these protests began, I guess, now going on in the third year, the Kremlin shifted strategy. The line before was that Putin was, quote, president of all the Russians. He presented himself as this national leader, which is the phrase they came up with in 2007 to describe him. And, kind of the father of the nation sort of thing. Once these mass protests broke out, the biggest street demonstrations in 2 decades in Russia, they shifted and they started to kind of, use the divide and rule tactics to oppose the supposedly decadent, supposedly westernized, or not supposedly, modern progressive urban middle classes against the, quote, traditional masses of the population, in their view. So that's been their line for the past 2 or 3 years. And for now, the figures are in their advantage, but the demographics and the spread of the internet, the spread of just, I would guess, civic consciousness and the real growth of civil society that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years in Russia, the trends are really not in their favor. In that figure I mentioned, the Levada poll, that just 22%, not even 1 in 4, want Putin to stay on as president after his term ends in 4 years' time. That's not a very good figure to have, I would say.
Okay. Donald?
It'd be interesting to see the effect, if any, I'm sure there will be, on the Russian voter of the events in Ukraine. Because I think that the Kremlin is no doubt very alarmed at what happened. Their foreign policy initiative of bullying Yanukovych to the east apparently has at least temporarily backfired. There was an internet map yesterday, because Lad's very right, they're very wired, map of where in Russia have the people taken over and thrown out the bums, and there was blank. There was just a red mark in Ukraine and a blue mark in the North Caucasus. And I think they are paying attention, and I'd be interested to see if it does have an effect.
Okay. Ariel, do you have something you want to say? No. Okay. All right. Yes. Oh, wait. Get microphone, please.
Hi, Sharon Bothat, Voice of a Moderate. Just for the average person that I'm doing an article for, would you say that it's going to affect the athletes? Normally there's a home court advantage, but when we talk about all these security threats and the extra interest, there seems to be more national patriotism now, kind of going back to the 80s. So would you say that all the issues that you've discussed today will affect the athletes? Has there been any discussion about that aspect?
Are you talking about American athletes or Russian athletes? Well, the challenge for the athletes is not to worry about what they can't control and focus on their performance. Those who care about gay rights will probably be insecure because of the Russian legislation and the public campaign on that issue. I think that the worst what can happen is actual attempted attacks or successful attacks, and I hope and pray that it will not happen. As Vladimir Kara-Muza is saying, this is probably the most security challenged Olympic Games ever, and when people were surprised, like in 1972 in Munich, when a Palestinian terrorist cell massacred the Israeli delegation. That was a horrible stain. I really, really hope nothing of the kind will happen in Russia. Unlike Munich, the Russian authorities are much more aware of the threat, but you cannot exclude it. You cannot 100% rule it out.
Just as a parenthetical aside, it's worth noting that a couple of days ago, one of the members of the U.S. hockey team actually said that his plan is to go to the Olympics, but he's actually asked his family to stay home because he doesn't want to be distracted worrying about their security, which I think is a large testament to exactly how insecure the athletes feel. They're going to go because they have a job to do, but are they comfortable? Probably not.
I'm going to ask a question because it sort of ties these two together, the domestic perception of the world and the athletics part of this. Are the Sochi Olympics Putin's Berlin Olympics? And who do you think is going to be Jesse Owens? If you're not familiar, I'll let them think about it because Hitler ran the Berlin Olympics as exactly this sort of nationalistic, everybody look at me kind of event, and a young black man showed him that the super race might not reside in Berlin. Gentlemen, any comments on it? Yeah, please.
Just want to make a quick comment. There certainly have been many analogies made between Berlin 36 and Sochi 2014. It's not to say that the regimes are similar, but the kind of the underlying attempt to present a repressive regime to show its kind of quote-unquote friendly face. And I think what's important is that, you mentioned Jesse Owens, but I think what's important is that the Western delegations, those from democratic countries who turn up, and there are still some politicians coming. It's not a total political boycott. I think it's important that they not do what every Olympic delegation except British and American did in 1936, which is do a Nazi salute to Hitler and the tribute. Everyone did it. The French did it. All the democratic nations except
Did the Soviets did it?
The Soviets were not part of the Olympics until the 50s. The Soviet Union wasn't in it. There was Spartakiad. That was a communist
They were not
alternative.
They were not in Berlin.
No. The first Soviet Olympic participation was in the 1950s in Australia, I think. But so they were not there.
Live and learn.
But all the democratic nations except Britain and the U.S. did it. So I hope nothing like that, obviously, in figuratively speaking, happens in Sochi. And as I mentioned, it's heartening to see that so many leaders of Western democracies are not going to Putin's show. Some of them explicitly said it's because of human rights issues, like some Central European and Baltic leaders. Some didn't say, but it's clear that it's still kind of a step towards their domestic audience to show that they do have some concerns over the human rights record.
No, just as an aside, I think given the sort of spotlight that's been put on the gay propaganda law and sort of all this anti-gay and lesbian rhetoric that's been coming out, not only from the Kremlin, but also from the Kremlin's political allies, for example, in the Russian Orthodox Church, I think you're going to see, at least media-wise, you're going to see maybe not a disproportionate focus, but certainly a significant focus on those athletes that are gay or lesbian and their performance, and obviously it's going to be measured against the standard, not that the world has set, but that the Russian government has set, which is, where do they fit sort of in the hierarchy of things.
Right. Other questions? Right.
I think, Steve, without going to Berlin, you can look at China.
Yeah.
You can also look at Greece, but you can look at China and see that the political structure of the regime does not preclude an efficient and successful Olympic performance. I think in Russia, it just, as I said, the cost overruns were just exorbitant.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Lee Avershove, International Consulting. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was superb. I personally think it's going to be much worse. I deal with aviation logistics as part of a very small part of Sochi issue. And I think we're very precise in terms of the inconveniences that the public will experience. There are projections that there will be a lot of empty spaces that will fill with people. So the question is, considering that it is a showcase, what's your forecast? Will the foreign media actually be taken in and they will show those adoring crowds and the successes? Or do you think we can expect at least some critical coverage, even inside of the cocoon that is being created inside of the steel ring? Any ideas? And I'm talking about the Western coverage, of course.
Mm-hmm. Well, just 2 words. I mean, I think if you look at the experience of the Beijing Olympics, I think the tendency is to be credulous on the part of the Western media. There wasn't a lot of, there were sort of on the outskirts, there was reportage about human rights and things like that, but in general, the narrative that the Chinese government tried to put forward was precisely what was imbibed sort of by everybody, including myself, sort of who's watching. But I think, you know, nothing succeeds like success, which means that this only works if there's not a significant security disruption. If there is a significant security disruption and the Russian government it's so large as not to be able to cover it up, then it begins to open up all of these lines of conversation that otherwise the credulous media wouldn't be inclined to pursue. So I think, you know, frankly it's sort of entirely up to sort of the dynamics of the events themselves.
I would distinguish between the sports coverage, the media, sports channels that will be focusing on sports, and the general interest channels, and especially the social media, who will try to provide a broader social context, be it the arrests and the releases of people we discussed here, be it, and I think this is very significant, and this was a miscalculation of major proportions when people were supposed to think forward about how they manage their image, including in the run-up to the Olympics. And I'm specifically mentioning the LGBT issues. I think they shot themselves in the foot, and they underestimated the influence and the solidarity inside media establishments, both major media establishments and in the social media. And this became a huge issue. People didn't think about it. And this is, hopefully somebody will learn a lesson, because it's always healthy to learn lessons. Whether they learn a lesson or not, I cannot tell you.
Okay, Don? Yeah, a friend of mine who works for CNN said they will cover the human rights aspect. My concern would be they're so focused on the LGBT issue, and I think we're all in favor of tolerance, and they forget, as Ariel said and what Vlad said, all these other human rights issues that are there every day, which are going on beyond the LGBT issue, and we hear nothing about it. The plight of migrant workers who are building some of the buildings, who are from the North Caucasus, who are routinely brutalized by Russian law enforcement authorities, I see very little about that at all. So the LGBT issue, meritorious as it might be, is obscuring everything else that's going on. And until we hear these names from Vlad, have you heard those lately? No, I haven't heard those names at all. And it's good to be reminded the broader situation.
Just going from Don's comment, I certainly hope that the coverage is not limited to, you know, buying the propaganda image that's kind of fed to the media. And, you know, it's already great that we're having discussions such as this, and that the global attention on Russia inevitably has some good side effects of more focus on the general situation. I just hope there's more of it. And about the political prisoners, and about election fraud, and about media censorship, and all the rest of it, but also about Sochi itself. You mentioned the cocoon that is Sochi, you know, not many people talk about the fact that Sochi has basically been turned into a de facto state of emergency zone, that the freedom of assembly has been suspended. Every big Olympic, you know, or any big sports event or any big international event obviously carries a lot of security. But this is going really beyond that, and you see, you know, there's no freedom of assembly, there's no freedom of movement. I mean, in any previous Olympic Games, you buy a ticket, you know, you have your hotel room, you go and attend the events. Not enough for Sochi. You need to have the passport of a fan, which is issued by the FSB, the successor to the KGB, the Domestic Security Service.
It's a sport management organization?
It is now, apparently. And just in the last week, we have heard of dozens of refusals to Russian opposition activists from Solidarity Movement, from the Republican Party, other opposition groups, Russian citizens who cannot go to the Olympic Games in their own country because they're deemed politically dangerous for the regime. I hope these issues are covered in Western media too, and not just the kind of the big high-profile issues that everybody talks about, and certainly not just the sports medals, but the fact that the Sochi Olympics have brought our country even more oppression, and even bigger crackdown.
I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative because that was a very sobering and the kind of note that we need to keep in mind as we head into this. The Olympics are generally a time of excitement and enjoyment, but there's a price with this particular Olympics that others are paying right now. And hopefully we can all keep that in mind as we watch, as we go forward. I'd ask you now to join me in thanking the panel for a great set of presentations. And I thank you all for joining us here at Heritage. Have a great day.